Come to Amendment 260A and the Earl of Lytton.
My Lords, I rise to move Amendment 260A in my name and to speak to Amendments 282J and 315B, which are linked to it. Now, I must first of all express my gratitude to Noble Baroness Lady Scott of Byford for her willingness to engage and wish her a speedy recovery and restoration to full health. But I do note with regret that a 35 or 40-minute slot is insufficient to cover the ground, and given the premise of my amendments has never been accepted, discussion on much of the detail has not been possible. Now, my Lords, I make it clear from the outset that I may wish to test the opinion of the House, but before deciding that, I particularly wish to engage the views of noble Lords on a matter which I believe is to be of fundamental importance to the purposes of good government, to justice, equality under the law and economic stability. And I refer to a list of a crib sheet, if I may call it that, which I did submit to the department. I hope it reached the Noble Earl's attention if he is responding to this, and I would just apologise for the fact that it wasn't sent earlier as I had intended, something to do with the stability of the electrical grid in my part of West Sussex during most of yesterday. Now, my Lords, I've outlined at committee the aims under these amendments, which have had the benefit of expert scrutiny by parliamentary and construction councils, construction administrators, conveyancers, academics, property professionals and trade associations, and there's been support from all of these quarters. I am therefore satisfied that the amendments are technically competent, complementary with the measures already in the Building Safety Act 2022 and capable of implementation. In short, they aim to make the development and construction sector responsible for defects in buildings arising from poor building practices and to prevent the burden either falling on innocent leaseholders in their homes or being funded by the taxpayer. And if I may, I'll just remind your Lordships of the basics of these amendments, but I won't go into detail. Firstly, it's aimed at simplification of establishing the initial liability without a lengthy legal process. This asks the questions if there's a significant critical defect in the original construction. If so, who was responsible for the works and what was their route to compliance? Secondly, it aims to reduce the contested areas to one largely of quantum via an adjudication process and the first-tier tribunal. Thirdly, it aims thereby to cut cost and risk barriers to leaseholders in getting redress directly or indirectly. And finally, it provides for a backstop levy where the defects are not as a result of construction failure or else where the developer or contractor no longer exists. The intention is that this should be wide and shallow and encompass materials, manufacturers, warranty providers, approved inspectors, specifiers and so on, as well as contractors. Now, of course, my amendments would mean that DLURB would have to do things differently, but I weigh that against the current situation of allowing innocent homeowners to bear the brunt. Going forward in the future, the incentive on house builders to cut corners must be replaced with an ongoing reminder to meet good construction practice at all times. The amendments also give exceptionally wide discretion to the Secretary of State in implementing proposals subject to certain core principles. So it is getting ahead of the process to claim, as some have, that these do not work. My Lords, more to the point, my amendments would dismantle much of the complexity that the government has decided to put in place with its own remediation scheme under the BSA. And I'm returning to this theme because I'm not satisfied with the government response I've received to date. My case rests on one of the most fundamental principles of humankind, namely that if somebody does something wrong and it injures another, they should provide restitution. Now, on the 13th of September last week, we discussed amendments to this bill on nutrient neutrality. There were outstanding speeches from these bench, not least the Noble Duke of Wellington, and a stellar contribution, if I may say so, from the Noble Lord Deben. And in response, the Minister stated, and it recorded at column 1060 in the official report, and I quote, "Another issue brought up by a number of Noble Lords is that the developer should pay. The government agree. It is essential that house builders should contribute fairly, and we are all agreed with the principle that the polluter should pay. End of quote. But here, in the context of building safety, it appears that the government does not accept that same principle. Or if it does, that it stops short of protecting all innocent leaseholders, or indeed of making developers and main contractors liable for the mistakes they made at the time of construction, at a point, my lords, when they had full agency and control over the construction project. Now, the ill effects, as we see them now, blight hundreds of thousands of leasehold owners who bought in good faith. I don't know the numbers, but I believe it's more than 200,000, a figure I have quoted before and the government has not disputed. Now, these people didn't buy a product sold discounted, quote, as seen, unquote, from a seconds rack, but a full value home, backed by warranties and certificates of every sort, covering many things they could not possibly see or inspect for themselves. And I took away from a meeting last week with the Minister and the Bill team that the government believes it is sufficient that the BSA has widened the Defective Premises Act so that leaseholders can better pursue big corporates via their freeholder for redress over demonstrable failings to construct buildings to the then regulatory standards. Further, to do so at their own risk and expense, and to bear the consequential costs meantime. And also that it's in order for affected leaseholders deemed non-qualified to continue to live in potentially unsafe blocks in a financial fix and under the cloud of remediation costs. Now, when we discussed similar amendments in the Building Safety Bill in 2022, speaker after speaker expressed a clear wish for focused and timely action and effective action. And as time goes by, there is a growing tally of enforced building evacuations, I believe it's now 27 since 2017, and a rising tide of leaseholders who are adversely affected. They've written to me in large numbers, some 250 since middle of March, telling me of waking watch costs, enormous insurance rises, crippling remediation bills, properties that cannot be sold or refinanced, and lives upended. What should have been the security of their homes is turned into a financial and emotional prison. And just very recently, some 51,000 people just signed a petition asking for something to be done. This is a problem, my lords, that has not gone away. So complicated are the rules under the BSA developed by our rather process-focused administration that even lawyers and conveyancers cannot figure it out and are now distancing themselves from handling work involving affected flats. I refer to the rules on leaseholder qualification, landlord certification, estimating remedial costs in times of rapidly rising prices, ascertaining landlord worth, the pitfalls leading to exclusions, the roulette of getting any recovery from original contractors, the programme for remediation, and the sheer arbitrariness and lack of clarity of it all. My fear is that the financial standing of these assets is next in line. The government assumed landlords as building owners had the money and the means to protect leaseholders. Well, some do, but their respective interests don't coincide. And it's a moot point whether building owners are any more responsible for the construction defects in their buildings than the occupiers. So the government apparent predilection for charging owners with open-ended responsibilities without clear route to cost recovery looks to me a less than even-handed application of equality under the law. And it's also perfectly clear to me that many freeholders don't have the assets to enable them to risk taking on contractors, whilst others may be minded to do a disappearing act or indeed become insolvent. And I know the government proceedings against Railpen in respect of Vista House, Stevenage, I'm sure the noble Baroness opposite will be familiar with that one, are still stuck in the courts. But in reality, no block owner or leaseholder collective could possibly afford to mount such a case. Now, in the nutrient debate, if I can call it that, on Wednesday, the noble Baroness and Minister's parting shot was that some £18 billion of added value to the economy was at stake. Well, my lords, that is not the only metric. The National Residential Landlords Association estimates, and it's the only estimate that I know of, that there are 1.7 million non-qualifying leaseholders in existence. Now, if just 10% of these are in buildings requiring significant remediation, and that appears to be the general experience of building owners in terms of the percentage, and even taking a well below average remediation and consequential cost per flat of, say, £20,000, that amounts to a staggering £34 billion write-down on the private sector alone, or nearly double what was bothering the Minister on Wednesday. Some observers put the damage north of 50 billion, and I can well believe it. Add in social housing and shared ownership, plus the potential sectoral damage in terms of market sentiment that is now, I believe, taking root, and it's potentially a lot more still. DLUHC's own latest data shows that the Building Safety Fund is still taking ages to process, approve and release funds, typically more than 3 years in a time of rapid inflation in construction costs. It reveals that as at the 14th of this month, there were 2,833 remediation registrations in relation to non-ACM, that's the cladding material, non-ACM private sector blocks, of which only 49 have had their problems fixed. But it seems in all this, the government is not collecting the data, still less sharing it. I have asked how many properties of 11 metres and below there are, or which may be affected, but the government does not seem to know this. It follows that the data on impacts is effectively unknown. How then, my lords, is policy made on this particular matter? My lords, I think everyone will agree that there has been a lot of time available to sort this out. So I believe the process does require the turbocharging my amendments would provide. I'm aware that the government objections to these amendments are many, but I don't believe they fully address the issues. There is currently a social evil taking root here in that innocent consumers are paying heavily for the mistakes of producers. One criticism is that the amendments would require individual building assessments and that would slow the whole process. But, my lords, how else does one identify or assess the essentially random nature of poor construction other than on a per-building basis? And another is that there isn't enough professional inspection capacity. But that applies whatever the total number of defects may be, unless, of course, the intention is simply to ignore some significant defects altogether. I'm told it would overstretch limited departmental resources. But, my lords, it is over 6 years since the awful tragedy of Grenfell Tower, and I do believe it's the job of government to take necessary action, not to wring its hands. The government says my solution is too complex. I say not half as complex as what it's already put in place. And remember, my lords, I'm not asking for a taxpayer bailout. The levy that is provided for in these amendments would deal with any shortfalls. We clearly aren't there yet, my lord. Conveyancing sources tell me that there is a growing trend at this very moment in contracts for sale of new flats where there are now inserted clauses placing the entire onus for future defects on the buyer on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. Meanwhile, I am not aware of any moves by the government to remove the unfairness of excluding so many leaseholders from its scheme, or indeed of its moves to put anything in place to tackle the building safety problems I've identified. Now, my lords, I'm going to say very little about the other amendments in this group, because I think it's fair that noble lords should speak for themselves on that. But I see there is some backing for the noble Lord Young of Cookham's Amendment 282 ND. Both he and I want effective solutions, and I remind the noble Lord Young that we stood shoulder to shoulder on previous amendments, and I was very grateful for his support there. But I think we probably diverge a little here. As I understand it, under his amendment, post-remediation qualified status would disappear. So if some further defect is then subsequently found at some later date, the building owner would then impose the costs of sorting it out on all the leaseholders, regardless of their original status, by which time, of course, the original constructor would probably be off the hook. Now, I'm not sure if that's what he intends, and I hope he will put my mind at rest. But I would also ask him whether his amendment deals with minority shared ownerships, of which I believe there are many. The other amendments in this group seek to mandate progress and other types of report, which is fair enough, but I don't believe it propels us to the more decisive solutions that I would wish to see. Now, recently one developer executive claimed that it was inappropriate for me as a chartered surveyor to be criticising his sector. So be it, my lords. I come here with not as a chartered surveyor, but as an independent crossbench peer. But I cannot finish without also commenting on an email received this morning from a cladding group soliciting my support for all the amendments in this group, apart from the ones that I am speaking to. So a complete absence of any reference to my own. Well, my lords, I'm perhaps not that, as you will see because I'm standing here, I'm perhaps not that easy to airbrush out of the sea. But I would just say I did reach out to a number of these groups early this year, had an online meeting with representatives, and at no time since has there been any further feedback from them. They've not suggested a different approach, let alone any support for the fundamental change I'm advertising. As far as I'm concerned, they have all been silent, or perhaps in silent opposition. My lords, why? Am I not asking for precisely the same things that they claim to want? Affected leaseholders may wish to ask why this apparent cancel culture has occurred. Now, I may be a long way from being the most proficient expert on political manoeuvrings in this place, but I do come to the House with professional knowledge and experience of property, construction, leasehold, building defect identification and remediation, valuation, and perhaps most significantly, with complete independence from any person or body and no motive beyond an abiding dislike of injustice. My lords, this is not the time for political manoeuvring, even less for sitting on the fence, but for action to protect leaseholders in particular. This may be the last opportunity to do anything for some time, and I believe the eyes of many are on us, fervently hoping that we will protect the 1.7 million leaseholders, as indeed we should. I hope, therefore, noble lords will understand why I have been so persistent as to what the scale of the problem is and the enormity of the damage that has already occurred and may yet to come. I invite your lordships to reaffirm your agreement with the principles I have set out in moving these amendments, or conversely to explain why in this debate I should not press the matter. I beg to move Amendment 268.
Amendment proposed after Schedule 20